Is crypto back, or are we still cosplaying a bull market?
I think that seeing the US open up and adjust its policy to be more crypto friendly did get the world stage really excited. I would say in terms of crypto, you can wake up one morning and the market could be down 10%, and then 24 hours later, it bounces back. The attractiveness of ETFs is there because people don't necessarily want to think about the volatility of crypto.
There was a recent poll here in the UK, and they said that right now 6% of the population actually holds Bitcoin. So that's really good news.
Yeah.
Everyone talks about narrative fit and founder market fit. What's actually your internal rubric when choosing token projects to support at Republic? Hello and welcome to the Ecosystem Show. I'm your host, Ade Molajo, and today I'm joined by Caitlin Szikszai. Through her role as go-to-market manager at Republic, Caitlin has been in charge of their token launchpad for the past year and a half. Before that, she'd been helping projects raise funding, but more so on the traditional startup side through Republic and her role as a growth fund. Hi, Caitlin. Welcome to the show.
Hey.
How are you?
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me. Super excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll just dive straight in because I have a number of questions to ask you. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, let's do it.
Perfect. So let's get straight into it. Is crypto back, or are we still cosplaying a bull market?
It's an interesting question just because we've seen so many ups and downs in the market recently. I actually heard someone say this the other day, and I really liked the way that it sounded, and it really made a lot of sense to me. But pretty much, I think with the US election and seeing a new president come into office, there obviously were a lot of good political signals. I think that seeing the US open up and adjust its policy to be more crypto friendly did get the world stage really excited. Saw a nice price fluctuation in that sense. But I think at the same time, with the global market taking a little bit of a pause, it affected crypto because crypto as an asset is still pretty coupled, I would say, with the general financial market. I think that a lot of the excitement that came about from policy changes, ETFs being introduced, is now being reinvigorated because it took a little bit of a gap time for institutions and providers to actually catch up to be able to provide these types of assets in different ways and to be able to create the infrastructure for it. So seeing a lot of these ETFs actually come to life, right? We saw the Bitcoin ETF get pushed through. We saw the Ethereum ETF get pushed through, but we're actually able to see it be offered. And so I do think that it's picked up that energy in the crypto market, which is great. And I do think that there are really positive signals, right? Like we're seeing the infrastructure for a very crypto-friendly future be created. We're seeing like assets get put into that, which is exciting. And then I think lastly too, because we've seen such interesting fluctuations in the overall market, crypto is starting to decouple a little bit, and governments are starting to talk about stables and how they want to hold their assets and reserve them. So I do think that there was a lot of hype and we saw viewing that happened over the past few months, but I do think that this new hype is more foundational. Obviously, I'm always going to be a little bit skeptical when it comes to crypto prices, but I do think like a lot of the pieces are coming into play, which is nice.
Yeah. Amazing. Some really good points made there. And I was also glad that you didn't stop at the political boost that crypto got and the fact that the hype that we're seeing now is not tied to that. If you were an outsider looking in, what would confuse you most about the current state of the market?
That's a good question. I would say in terms of crypto, you can wake up one morning and the market could be down 10%, and then 24 hours later, it bounces back. I think for outsiders who maybe are more familiar with stock markets, like we talk about things in basis points, which is so different in comparison to crypto. So I do think that like the attractiveness of ETFs is there because people don't necessarily want to think about the volatility of crypto. And if you trade crypto and are in the space and enjoy doing that, you know that it comes with a lot of risk appetite that you have to have. And then also too, like sometimes it can pull on your emotions. I think it'll be interesting seeing a lot of more mainstream investors come into crypto, because even like in the way that like sometimes my family will text me like, hey, what's going on in the market? So what should I do? And I'm always like, you know what, like you need to think about your risk appetite, but I personally am
Yeah,
just gonna like ride it
exactly.
out. But I think that's really the biggest thing, like for outsiders, it's like understanding that like markets can go up and down based on knowledge that doesn't necessarily make it to the public. For example, like
Yeah,
unlocks of tranches or knowing that big whales are selling, things like that. So I think that can sometimes be like a little bit off-putting, but hopefully ETFs and other types of ways to get into the market will become ways that people can onboard and become crypto holders in that sense.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. There was a recent poll here in the UK,
Mhm.
and they said that right now 6% of the population actually holds Bitcoin. So that's really good news.
Yeah.
That's really good news.
I think that one other
Yeah.
thing I will say is looking forward to having more direction and vision. I don't know how strict it is in the UK, but even in the US, New York State, for example, is really conservative when it comes to crypto. And I live in New York City, and even I've been recognizing that in terms of my ability to invest and how much money I can put in on Coinbase has changed. So I do think that although we are moving to the direction of a more regulated space and really excited to get there, it does feel a little bit more difficult as an investor to be able to put like as much assets that I want to on chain in that sense. So that's my take, but would be curious to hear about how it is in the UK too and like ease of crypto investing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty much the same, really. Regulation isn't very crypto friendly.
Yeah.
I'd say even less crypto friendly than the US. We've never had a government that was pro crypto, so at least you had that boost for a while. We're still very much in the stone ages here in the UK. In fact, someone was telling me that they were applying for a crypto role at a really big bank, and they told them that they would either have to move to Singapore or to Dubai if they got the job, even though they were applying from the UK. That's how
Yeah.
bad it is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's tough too, right? Where in the US, crypto holders will encourage for positive policy, but people who hold crypto is so much lower. It's who's going to even advocate for that policy. So it'll be interesting to see. I think the probably one thing is just it's such a large economy. And if countries aren't willing to tap into the economy, they're going to be back foot when inevitably it becomes like a really huge way to transact assets. So yeah, it's a cool thing to see unfold in front of our eyes. I'm sure
Yeah.
you've probably been in the crypto space for longer than I. Just seeing how things have developed in the case of 6 months, a year, a few years it's really interesting to see it like happen in
Yeah.
lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah. Super interesting. Never a dull moment, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Everyone talks about narrative fits and founder market fits. What's actually your internal rubric when choosing token projects to support at Republic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have a lot of thoughts on tokens just because I work with so many projects that push out tokens. I've had so many different types of conversations. I've had some companies who like to develop and build their token first and then focus on product second. I think that in the past cycle, we've seen a lot of tokens launch on vibes and hype, but
Yeah.
not necessarily on product and feature acquisition. I really like to see in market traction, understanding who's on testnet, how that user interaction is, the user growth going up, is it organic, all those
Mhm.
type of things. So I think that really having in market traction and then also just being really reactive to your community, like what products are you pushing out? How are people reacting to them? How open are you to feedback from the people who are actually using your product and protocol is really important in my eyes because in the industry, it's so easy to bot out your audience and your product. And
Absolutely.
there's at the end of the trail, which is like token launch, TGE, sometimes even sales on our platform. That's when you're going to really see the reckoning where I think that sometimes companies can like in their own mind continue along and be like, wow, I have this audience and almost believe it themselves when in
Yeah.
reality it's a lot of bots and people who actually don't care what you're building. So
Exactly.
at some point, you're going to have the reckoning of who cares what you're building, who's actually using it, things like that. Showing like in-market signals is something that's really important to me. And I think that whenever companies are coming to the platform, I'm always asking like, where's the product? Have you pushed it out yet?
Hmm.
And if someone's, oh, we're focusing on the token first, product second, I'm like, I don't know. It's not really for me.
Exactly. And on that note, what's more important, traction or to actually be profitable, if that's even a thing in crypto yet?
Profitability is less important because in crypto and even non-crypto, we're seeing a lot of companies that aren't profitable. I do think that you need to have good legs on your path to profitability,
Yeah.
understanding what those revenue lines are and like bonus points if you already are producing revenue and you can see like the proof that it's there. So I think profitability is always going to be tough, but I think showing revenue traction is great. But in reality, I think even that is,
Yeah.
sometimes for projects is too early stage in terms of when I'm chatting to them, because a lot of protocols and projects are just focused on user acquisition once they're there, understanding how to turn on revenue or planning on how to turn on revenue. So as long as there's good like paths that make logical sense, it's usually fine for me. But yeah, I think profitability is tough in crypto and in regular startup land too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And do you still believe in the idea of a crypto native founder, or has crypto matured to the point where domain outsiders have the edge now?
I wouldn't necessarily say that domain outsiders have the edge. I think in terms of retail onboarding, because of their legitimacy in names for outsiders and the familiarity, these
Mhm.
really strong players. And a lot of the times too, like we're seeing with the RWA craze right now that like a lot of
Yeah.
financial institutions with legacy names are looking to come into industry. I do feel like they need a guide through the space as well though too. And so I think it's really important to see those global institutions partnering with crypto native founders and crypto native chains or protocols to help guide them through. And so it's interesting where a lot of these chains are becoming liaisons, like amongst like the Web 2 and the Web 3 world.
Yeah.
So I do think that they are a lot of more institutional names that are coming into the market, but I don't necessarily think they have an edge. Like they need a guide to have an edge, and whoever that guide is can help dictate what direction they go in the space.
Exactly. So PYUSD or USDC?
I am I'm just like my company does most of our transactions in USDC. So just because of my
Yeah.
familiarity, I would say that. And that's what the most familiar
Yeah.
asset that I have and I hold. I actually don't know too much about PYUSD. Do you mind giving me a quick little?
Yeah, that's PayPal's stablecoin,
Mm.
and they are offering, I think it's 5% now for anyone who holds and deposits it on their platform.
Interesting. I feel like I don't know. USDC and at least in its name not being tied directly to an institution or like a monopoly there kind of make, but I don't know. It's interesting. I know there's so many stable coins and companies being like, we're creating your own stable. And I'm not sure I really understand that. I feel like it's trendy and just what people want to do. But I'd be
Very
curious to
much.
hear if you have any hot takes on that too.
It is on the large part, it is very trendy. There's a lot of outfits out there just releasing a stablecoin because it's the hot thing in the crypto space.
Yeah.
But then I look at the vanilla stables like USDC, which is really hot in places like the UK, the US. But then if you go to the emerging world, if you go to Africa, to Southeast Asia, to LATAM, then it's more of a case of USDT because the Tether crew actually has boots on the ground there
Mm.
and they're doing a lot of work to market and push their product in that part of the world. But then if you're an institution in the US, you're probably looking at Ondo or Athena. So I think many of these stables have their use cases, and there will be a time when we see a lot of consolidation because I think a lot of them are just like meme coins. They serve no value, but they're hot right now, and that's all that's important. But if we move on from that, what's one project category or trend that you think is wildly overrated right now? I know we just spoke about stables, so maybe that.
Yeah, I feel like stables, I think it just goes back to the root thing. And again, too, like I work with a ton of different projects that are pushing out tokens. I get to hear a lot of pitches, which is cool, and understanding like where people's thought process is in this space. I think that I see people uh, gravitate towards launching tokens because it's a easy way to fundraise and like a
Yeah.
good conversation starter, things like that. But I do sometimes feel like there's a lot of companies and products where I'm like, okay, do we actually need a token for this? Or if you don't have any traction on your product, do you need a token to help power it yet?
Yeah.
I really a believer, and I think that through, again, like I said, through this past cycle, we're seeing that people are taking pause and being like, okay, let me build my product first and get traction there and then understand if this is something that's really interesting. And that doesn't mean you can't still like fundraise on the premise of a token and have a warrant tied into your round and things like that. But I do think that a little bit more intentionality around tokens would be good, whether it be stables or whether it be just like a token that someone's using to power their own platform. I think that we have reached a bit of a saturation point where like in the dot-com boom, we saw so many companies going online. And I think that there needs to be a little bit of consolidation just because on exchanges, like there's so many tokens that are listed and so many tokens that'll just die off because no one really there are. And I think the other thing too that I always like to point out is that companies are like so bullish on pushing out a token because it's like a fundraising mechanism. But at the end of the day, when the token hits market, people don't realize that community management for a token is a lifelong thing. As long as the token's around, like you're going to need someone who's going to be making sure that awareness around their token is there to your community, like if you want it to survive. So I think a lot of the times founders get swept up in this hype of, I'm going to push out a token, but don't actually realize that there's a lot of work that goes into keeping this token alive. And it's and until the token's not there anymore, which theoretically it's going to be around forever, you need to keep on managing it.
That's right. That's right. And on the flip side, what's an underrated theme you think will define the next cycle? Something most investors are sleeping on right now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the way that projects are changing their funding structures. I think that, again, because most of my conversations that I have with founders are around fundraising and token, I think that a lot of people are starting to take note of, hey, if you take on a ton of VC funding at the beginning and it's overvalued and they have unlocks at TGEs, you can see some pretty nasty like cliff dives when companies list on exchanges. And I think that projects are starting to realize it's okay, even though they're able to raise a lot of funds in the process, that ultimately in the long run, it's going to cause them a lot of difficulty. So I think that I'm seeing founders and in my conversations finding them to be a lot more mindful about the capital that they take on and how that they're taking it on, deciding whether or not they really want to bring out a token so early in the phase of their project. And I'm excited to see adjustments next cycle in the way that companies are taking on capital and raising on tokens. Like I've talked to some founders and they've been like, we're giving no one an unlock at TGE. And we've told every single investor, and even if one of the top investors comes along and says that they want to participate, but they won't agree to that, like we won't let them in. And like, I feel like that in my mind and that intentionality that you can start to see coming up in founder conversations is really proving to it's okay, like this person's here for the long run. Like they're actually building something that they're like putting their whole chest behind, which is cool.
Wow. That's really good on them.
Yeah, it's
So
really,
even if
really
they
interesting
had,
when that popped up. I was like, whoa, that's a good concept.
say, even if they had this big investor that had 2 letters and 2 numbers in their name, they would still tell them there's no token or locks at the start.
Yeah, and it's like it's a coalition in a way, right? Where if you go to all of your investors and say, hey guys, if you want to join, this is the term you have to agree to, and you bend the rule for one person, you've suddenly turned your back on all these other investors that you've brought in on this premise. So I think that was their whole idea in their mind. And I do think that there is, I think there's like a certain amount of duty that you find in that, where as an investor, if I heard that and been like, wow, like all these other people came on, knowing that it would encourage me and want me to participate in something like that too. Because I do think that's like a positive structural change. We'll see. in terms of tokenomics. I think certain projects can do it and can lead the charge in that sense. So excited to see those types of tokenomic structure take a little bit more power in the industry.
Absolutely. It really points to sustainability, which is something we're missing right now in this space. So we've seen, as far as narratives go, we've seen AIX crypto, RWA hype, social fi resurgence. What trend is going to be investable, not just tweetable, in the next 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that I was talking to one of our partner investors and they had brought up the point they're really focused on infra. And I think that if you think of any of these overarching trends, you have to think about the infrastructure that will support them. For example, for AI, a lot of it's going to be like data storage, processing, facilitation between AI agents and creating these layers. You can always bet on a AI company. But I do think that if you start looking at the actual infrastructure that will be needed to support that area or RWAs or social fi, then you can start banking on a whole vertical while touching all of the projects that are using their product and built on top of them. So I'd say that like any infrastructure that supports those industries is something that I would bank on a rain winner in the next cycle, just because it's like, it's not necessarily like you're banking on one AI company or one RWA company, but you're really able to touch a lot and kind of put your weight behind the whole industry in that sense.
Very true. So when I think about AI infrastructure, on the one hand, I think about AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, and on the other side, I think about the likes of IO.net. Do we need decentralized data centers? Or will we be fine with the traditional centralized counterparts?
It's a good question. I think that even with centralized counterparts, we're seeing that there can still be faults. And I think decentralization is always something to aim towards. I think especially as we're seeing these really big companies like Google try to take their own monopoly with AI too. It's important to dilute their in that sense, but at the end of the day, like I still think they're going to be huge players in the space.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. In 2027, when we look back at the projects launched this year, what will be the biggest differentiator between those that survived and those that didn't?
Yeah, I think that the projects that are able to actually facilitate use and adoption. And I think two of the biggest factors, and it loops to a lot of the overarching themes that we've had in this conversation, is like building a product and shipping. Actually want community management, understanding like who that user is and how to onboard them. I think we've seen a lot of projects just like launch on vibes, and that's awesome. But then you also see like their user use and their TVL kind of going on a sloping downwards to the right chart, where it's like on the other's hands, you're seeing some chains who have been building more mindfully and maybe in private initially, but now as people are starting to use and understand, oh my gosh, like this actually has a lot of real value, you're seeing like an incline in terms of their usership and their TVL. So I think that really it goes back to not getting too caught up in the hype, making sure that you're actually like providing a value of service and listening to the people that are actually using your product in that way.
Yeah. And Caitlin, you strike me as someone who speaks their mind. What's one unpopular opinion you hold about the crypto VC landscape that others are afraid to say out loud?
Yeah, I don't know. I think just from working with an array of people, understanding that crypto can still be a pretty predatory landscape in terms of scammy projects that get pushed through, scammy projects that get funding and pull people into at the end. People can get away with a lot in crypto. And I don't love that, I think, but especially at the early stage, a lot of it is VCs are coming on because a company has the right signal, but they don't necessarily dig into like actually understanding like if the tech is there and if the team has the right intentions. And I do think that there is a pretty large amount of money in the ecosystem that sometimes does go to people with the wrong intentions, and in the bit retail and like users are getting burned by it. We've seen it so many times, and like it feels every quarter there's some sort of story where you're hearing retail users get the really short end of the stick there.
That's right.
And I think too, it goes into the whole like the funding part of things too, where it's like a lot of VCs will get in at the very beginning at really low, have a large unlock at TGE. And then as soon as the token hits the market, they don't mind because they already have a 4 or 5x on their investment just from selling that like small portion of their unlock. So I do think that people are waking up to, okay, this structure of funding or tokenomics isn't necessarily working. And so I do think that we've seen a constriction of actual retail people investing in the altcoin market because they're seeing this kind of game that's being played out. So I think that as long as we're able to move away from that direction, I think the interesting thing about about crypto is that like everything is done so publicly and people can really watch, where it's like maybe in private startup funding, a lot of it's done more behind the scenes and it's not as public, so people can't catch on to it. So I do think that naturally this type of structure will get phased out, but it is taking a little bit of time.
Yeah. Growing pains. And lastly, if someone wants to get on your radar at Republic, what should they absolutely not do?
Yes, that's a good question. I think it goes to making sure that like your outward facing materials are solid. As I said, too, paying attention to detail around the branding, but then also the product itself too. I think if a company or someone comes to me just like with a project idea, I'm always going to be like, it sounds great. What does your go-to-market look like? And let's talk in like a few months after that's been in process. And I do think in crypto, go-to-market and onboarding of users and like initial launch of testnet can happen very quickly, fast you ship. But I would say that any project that hasn't done some sort of go-to-market or some sort of product launches is probably a little bit too early for us. So I like to see that kind of like traction in real world traction. And then of course too, just making sure that like your outside looks good. Because if we are to work together, I want to know that everything's buttoned up and like on the horizon of being able to work together in that sense.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And on the flip side, if someone wants to get in touch with you, how can they reach you?
Yes, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. I can even provide my email. I always look at projects and can kind of screen in that sense. But on my LinkedIn, I have my email as well. But really, I feel like I'm pretty easy to get in touch with. Of course, they can reach out to you as well. But I always like to just take a look at a blurb, a deck, websites, things like that, just so I can get familiarity and see if it makes sense for us. But yeah, always open to looking at things.
Caitlin from Republic, thank you so much for your time. This has been amazing. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Ade. Thanks for having me.